Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Pentester Recruiter podcast. Today, I'm joined by Tim Gonda. Tim, how you doing?
Good to be here, Thomas. Thanks for
Good. Yeah, nice to have you. For everyone listening, Tim is the technical director of cloud at Praetorian. He's also previously been a cloud security engineer. Just saying to Tim off air, I'm really looking forward to this week's episode. Tim is very knowledgeable around cloud security, to say the least. Normally, when I'm talking to technical people, I can really hold my own, but Tim, I have to admit, some of the conversations we had last week about cloud, I was a bit out of my depth.
Hopefully, I can break it down and inform everybody what we're talking about today.
No, take it as a compliment. And look, I think it's an area. Again, we were just saying off air. Cloud security, obviously, huge growth area, massive chance for any pen testers that are up and coming to make some huge progression gains. Whether you're mid-level, junior level, senior level, it's an area where if these skills are sharp, it can really give you an extra string to your bow and also do a really good thing in the security space because the demand is so heavy around CloudSec. But Tim, look, I've done you a bit of an intro. I could never do it as well as you. If you wouldn't mind telling me and the listeners who you are and what you've been up to, my friend.
Absolutely. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Tim Gonda. As Thomas has previously stated, I am the technical director of cloud. Now, that title is deceiving, as what that title actually oversees is the offensive security consultants practice at Praetorian, who's for the cloud business unit, which means that we do pen testing in the cloud. Previous to Praetorian, I've worked all manner of cloud engineering, MSP, to security engineering, managed service provider, or MSP as previously stated, as well as worked in DevOps shops, as well as a senior cloud security engineer at a Fortune 500 media company. I went through, a variety of different fields, and it was the perfect time for me to jump into the security field in an up-and-coming, this was back in about 2015, an up-and-coming area of IT called cloud. Previous to then, we could say everything was done in data warehousing, on-prem servers that lived in a closet. Getting a VM provision could take a matter of months. And the paradigm of cloud is you could have this today, as well as have that New Balance hit your credit card if you weren't careful. There was a lot of learning that happened through the industry regarding this, such as how do we ensure best practices? And this was both on the consumer side as well as the cloud provider side, such as how do we want to do this? Such as the cloud provider side at the beginning was like, all right, we're going to do it in a way that makes it easiest for us. And then the customers had to pick up the sack of, okay, I have to now know this technology that I didn't develop in-house. I have to figure out how it works and learn this new user interface between me and my resources. And some of that was complicated in the beginning. And mistakes are made on both sides. The cloud provider sometimes either released a service that with a setting that was by default maybe insecure. They got much better about that down the road. Or maybe just users click the easy buttons to make sure they could get to their resources, do development, do all the things, and just figured, that's good enough. I'll come back to this later. In the beginning, cloud security was very much it came under many different names. We had concepts where cloud security was a way of segregating your cloud environments from on-prem with like firewall connectors, web proxies. We had the concept of a CASB, which meant that everything between you and your cloud provider went through some sort of web proxy and was detecting all the shadow IT things, and you could whitelist things or say that certain content couldn't be allowed through. And then later we realized that, okay, maybe that isn't the most scalable way to do this. And we started pivoting to other ways. We started looking at different ways of connecting our on-prem data centers into the cloud. And later we started shifting those resources that were maybe in our closets into the data center, and then later would be moved up into the cloud provider if they were still needed. And security in the cloud looks a little bit different. It becomes a lot of things are secure by default, but there's a lot of patterns you have to be aware of, and more certain things like what can you afford to do, such as I'm sure that on an on-prem data center, you control the firewalls, you control the ISP connection coming in and out of your building. On the cloud provider, you can do that as well. However, you're also charged for the traffic going in and out, as well as the firewall technology and or network traffic that you're now duplicating or pushing into certain areas. And when we start looking at use cases such as, let's say, a pretty good example, when you look at broadcast or maybe Netflix, it probably doesn't make sense. Actually, Netflix might be a bad example. Let's say Disney Plus. Let's say Disney Plus that probably has a cloud presence. I can't confirm or deny that. I don't
Yeah,
work there.
I'm sure it
But,
does. I'm sure it does.
but maybe is serving content to a large variety of folks that want to watch the newest season of The Mandalorian. And it probably doesn't make sense to inspect every single piece of traffic that's going outbound. There's also different things, there's different aspects of the identity of how you provision access into this environment, such as do you hook this up to your Active Directory systems on-prem? Do you rely on maybe a third-party authentication system that's also maybe backed by your AD system, maybe Okta? Or do you maybe allow your developers to have direct cloud credentials to this environment? And all of these different things, because of how this environment got very complex very quickly, it was a new paradigm. We realized, the industry at large started realizing that what we really needed to detect was when we, in the beginning, this was probably 2017, 2018, 2019, we started really having to focus on, okay, we got to detect when things are misconfigured because this is what's going to burn us. And a good example of a misconfiguration burning, although albeit unfair, is the Capital One breach. This happened a long time ago. It was a result of a server-side request forgery and allowed someone to extract data from an S3 bucket that was available. I'm not doing the greatest job of explaining it. If you look at the Capital One breach, you'll get much more details on it, specifically Capital One breach S3. That was a paradigm shift of realizing that, okay, most cloud industry at large realized maybe we shouldn't have certain resources open to the internet and relying on maybe a single compute resource that only has 2 CPU cores to handle protecting itself from like RDP connections from around the globe as you open this resource up to the public internet. And when we say the public internet, and when someone connects a security group to a resource where it says 0.0.0.0/0, what that means is anything that has a network connection, but any cloud provider attempts to talk to, just like hosting a public website, your resource, which just might be a simple Windows server or just a simple web server, now is having to contend with forces on the outside that may have more resources than they ever would if they were in your internal network. If someone's in your internal network, they're limited by bandwidth, they're limited by the controls that you have, and they're limited by when you start exposing things to the public internet, it becomes a much more dangerous game, such as they know how the internet works, they know what they're looking at, and you may not be their only target.
Yeah.
Let's see, I'm leaning on a lot of AWS examples, but a good example is if you look for the IP JSON that actually that covers the entire IP space of AWS or the public addresses reserved, and then you look at the contents of Shodan, which is also categorizing all of these items, you take a diff of the two, you start being able to find possible targets or possible misconfigured things to start having fun with, and probably the earliest things that I used to have to deal with is, I think it was Drupal drive-bys, meaning that there was a Drupal admin plugin that was exposed and was misconfigured, was out of date. Someone came across, saw it was there, ran the exploit, and compromised the web server. I just figured that was a quick introduction. And so as we move forward, we've moved along from misconfigurations, turning things on and off, to now where context is key.
Okay.
We need to be able to marry business context with those misconfigurations and maybe our application flows, and that really becomes the true attack surface that we now have to deal with in cloud security.
Okay, thank you, mate. Thank you. Listen, there's loads to unpack there. Thank you, Tim. Since the advent of cloud, Tim, I was thinking, company TikTok, would they have even been able to scale at the pace they scaled at without the cloud? When you think about the amount of additional server and storage space they would have needed at the pace they would have needed, like without kind of vendors like AWS, it just wouldn't have been able to scale at that pace. Same with some other like really fast scaling successful startups. It makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah. So previous to cloud, and this was actually something I got into an argument with my father once. I said that I could spawn up 200 Windows servers that were all properly configured with a manner of 8 minutes. What that actually meant was I spawned some EC2. I manned a PowerShell script that spawned a bunch of EC2 instances with a user data script. Not that impressive. However, to do that manually would require that you have to rack the hardware. You have to make sure your local network is configured correctly. That's 2 weeks right there. You have to make sure that your OS is configured correctly. That might take you a couple days. And we have to go through each of these services, like just step by step, and just scaling. You then have to work. We've gotten better at this now. When you look at tools like Ansible or Kubernetes, where we can move stuff on-prem very fast and very quickly. I believe there's one person that has decided he's going to go against cloud and moved all of his stuff back on-prem. I'm aware of one particular voice in the industry that does that. However, but for the most part, everyone has embraced the idea of,
Yeah.
I want to be able to spin up a development server. I don't really want to maintain the raw infrastructure anymore. I
Mm.
want the easy button, and I want to
Mm.
be able to focus on what my job is, which is to deliver business value. And that's how companies looked at it. And as a pen tester, it's really important to say that cloud is not this future thing. Nobody is purposely built, except that one person. No one is purposely building a on-premise application anymore unless they have a very specific use case. Most things are going to be built in a cloud provider or will go to a cloud provider at some point after they're done with local development. And as a pen tester, you have to realize that the things that are valuable for that business are contained within that cloud environment. And being able to move past certain skills that you might pick up in your OSCP, your OSWE, you're going to also have to pick up cloud skills and just learning to live off the land in those environments. Because there's a lot of simple things that you can do to actually just to check if certain things are there, or simple exploits that you can do that if those misconfigurations or if a logic error in an application or access control is missed, means that pretty easily you may not always have to do a full-blown like super advanced compromise. It could be fairly simple to say, I've got the business data, here we are,
Mm.
objective done.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no two ways about it, Tim. Cloud's here to stay. Just logistically and everything, it is just, from a scalability perspective, it is just game changing. So, I say the benefits are there, but obviously so are the security issues. I don't want to be one of these people that kind of badmouths end users, but I know from a cloud security perspective, and I know the vendors are perhaps starting to do more, but I know it's frightening what end users can do in the cloud. And I asked someone for some advice on cloud security once, and he just went, configurations and configurations.
Those pesky configurations and or design decisions can be costly in the wrong incident.
Yeah.
I've seen cases where it wasn't you wouldn't call this a classic misconfiguration, and in fact it could be valid.
Mm.
However, I've seen a case where a load balancer was configured to point to the wrong endpoint, and instead of serving traffic to a proxy which was supposed to point it to its end application server, what ended up happening is it pointed to the Jenkins administration instance, which is a problem because that means you can start modifying things on their infrastructure with their build infrastructure. Not a pretty sight. And the problem with some of these misconfigurations is they're not intentional. For
No,
example,
indeed.
one of the things that we bash on anyone that leaves an open S3 bucket, that's been very well popularized. But
Mm.
there's a lot. But when we talk about the access controls for a lot of these services, it could be a JSON file. It could be the structure that the cloud service provider has put together to help rationalize how access is supposed to be provisioned for this, or who and what is allowed to talk to the service. And it might make sense to them, and it might make sense in the documentation, but sometimes you may just have a slight misunderstanding, or the documentation may not be super clear at a particular time. And what might happen is you might think, okay, this works in my testing. I tested a couple different things here, but you might have misconfigured something, or there might be an edge case you didn't think about because it wasn't a part of your current work stream that might indicate that. And a common one is if you an AWS, or I can also do the Azure version of this, where in AWS and certain access policies, if you put principal in the principal field, AWS colon star, what ends up happening is that you've said anyone that is an AWS identity in any AWS account within reason. There are certain AWS regions that
Mm.
aren't connected to the
Mm.
public internet, but are now allowed to potentially access this resource,
Okay.
which you did not intend.
No.
But at the same time, and it may not be immediately apparent, but it's something that comes up in pen tests all the time. Another one that's super fun is that there are certain settings in Azure where you might, and I'm not sure who needed this, but it's
Mm.
a cool feature that any Azure resource can connect to your database. We're not quite sure why you would want to do that. Typically, a database is something you've locked down, you put in the back next to an application server, because that may be how you're maintaining application state. But those settings do exist, and you
Mm.
do need to look out for them.
Yeah.
So a lot of, and this will bring us into one of the differences between, and it's a similar process to on-premise or traditional pen testing or web application pen testing. The item of enumeration in the cloud, because the cloud environment spans like thousands of services across the three main providers. I think it's like 1,000 something across different service endpoints, but you need to be able to see what are the different misconfigurations across all those services that might be in scope of your pen test, and be able to quickly rationalize, I'm going to attack this is wrong, or this could be something I could abuse to my advantage.
Okay. So Tim, if I just take it back a few notches, so if I am, and by the way, some of the stuff there, it sounds like the vendors could be doing more, and I'm sure we'll get onto that later on in the episode. But if I'm maybe I'm a senior pen tester, but I've just been avoiding the cloud because I'm a little bit worried about it, or maybe I'm mid-level or even junior. If I am getting into cloud security from an offensive security perspective, where is the best place to start? And have you got any tips from a progression perspective?
Certainly. Typically, it's a matter of passion. So, for example, I'd recommend if you're working on getting into the security or pen testing industry, going after a pen test cert. There are a couple different certification providers, most notably OSCP and OSWE, just to get your basics right.
Mm.
That's probably where I'd still start. But once you get past that, or maybe you're mid-level, or maybe you're ready to, you said, I've done a lot of these like traditional networks. You said, like, I've done the Nmaps, I've done the Metasploit, I've done the Burp Suite. I want to do something a little more challenging. I personally would start with an introductory cloud certification.
Okay.
So a good example would be an Azure, just Azure administration of AZ 104. In AWS, I recommend as a starting point the AWS Solutions Architect Associate, and then the GCP Cloud Engineer Associate. And the reason I suggest these certs is they're not on the very bottom. How do you interact, or how should you interact with these cloud environments? I could go to ad nauseum of all the other fun certs you should go look at, but I recommend picking a cloud provider, probably one you have access to either at home in your home lab, and you've signed up with your personal credit card. Be careful of what you're spending your money on and double check that bill. But for example, if you work in AWS, or you have a job function where you might interact with Azure, or maybe your company has a firing range in GCP, use whatever cloud environment that works to your advantage and learn that. I recommend learning how it works, and then later taking that newfound knowledge and then taking your threat modeling cap and saying, okay, how can I abuse this? Or what could this give me an advantage later if I'm on a pen test against this particular technology? You'll find that most cloud services, or a lot of cloud services, this was more true in the older days, they're sometimes based off open source, or were originally based on open source software, or things that could be commonly found, or things you can commonly build. But the cloud providers, over many iterations, figured out better ways that were more reliable, more scalable, more secure ways of interacting with these technologies, and then prepackage them up to be more readily available to you. So, what do we know about this? Depending on how fast they needed to bring this to production, certain shortcuts were made. They weren't the worst. What may not be immediately apparent. That's where we get certain cloud security research articles that says, "Hey, I found this really obscure vulnerability in this database that allowed me to get access to other users' data." That's great. On the average cloud pen test, we're not going to such extremes. We're typically looking for things that are readily available and really living off of how certain cloud services work to be able to reach to our goals. And one way we do that is if there's and a good example is one thing that you may not have thought of during a pen test or may not be readily apparent. Let's say we have a serverless application where we have some sort of serverless function. A serverless function is an environment that usually runs like a Docker-like container, runs a piece of code where you provide the code, and then you give it JSON, it outputs JSON. That's what you're working with. However, how you might receive data into that JSON pattern, maybe through means that may not, for example, a very common one is maybe an SNS, or maybe some sort of messaging bus queue. And sometimes that messaging bus queue, inadvertently, probably in frustration of trying to build it, may be misconfigured. Remember, if we talked about earlier about AWS star, meaning all principles, or maybe all Azure principles, anyone being able to ship things to that bus may be able to send payloads that otherwise would bypass, or would otherwise be filtered through a web application firewall to the application. And then suddenly you might be able to go from another route, be able to send things that typically you wouldn't have access to abuse that piece of code that might give you that sweet target data that you want. I could probably go ad nauseum on WAF stuff as well, but let's stop there for now.
No, Tim. Just thanks for that, mate. By the way, and just I might be wrong in saying this, but I got the impression from what you were saying then. Would you say it would almost be advisable? We'll just pick AWS as an example. Say if I want to get really good at pen testing AWS, do you reckon it's almost at first just to take your pen testing hat off and just literally master that environment and just learn the ins and outs? Because I felt like a few things you were saying there you obviously really know the environment and you know the functionality within that environment, which enables you to be able to pen test it really well. So, do you think that would be good? Just master the environment first, then get your hacking hat on afterwards, or how do you?
Sometimes it's a combination of both. That's a copying answer, but I'll explain it right now. Whenever you learn, it's important to take the pen testing hat off and learn how the environment works and how your users are using it, and also what are the underlying technologies that are actually at work and at play or doing, and learn those types of behaviors and patterns. Those patterns you're going to see replicated across the different cloud providers because they have to offer similar functionality
Okay.
and similar capabilities. Once you learn what a capability does, now the reason I wouldn't say master all of it, and the reason I suggest going for the AWS Solutions Architect Associate, the AZ 104, and the GCP Associate Cloud Engineers, we're typically focusing on a couple key components. If you are going to master something, master or identity access management controls. This is how you provision privileges in the environment. And a privilege escalation inside of a cloud environment is the one thing that will get you access to more things than anything else.
Okay.
You might defeat the network, you might defeat one access control policy, but if you defeat an IAM or identity access management control, or get access to identity that isn't yours and wasn't meant to be yours, but someone left the door open by accident, you have the capability to do some real damage. So probably the two things I would start out with for a new pen tester is learn how IAM works, and then learn how network controls and how networking works in a cloud environment. If you can master those two things, you're well on your way to repeating the same things you would do on an OSCP in a cloud environment. And
Okay.
in an OSWE environment, if you learn how IAM works, maybe if you get that either remote code execution or SSRF, and provided they're using, for AWS specifically, if they're using IMDS v1, you might be able to send AWS commands from the application to the underlying host and be able to make certain actions that you weren't otherwise granted privileges to. All of
Okay.
these things, and if I would say those are the two top things I would start with. I'd also recommend, you posted some wonderful resources in a blog post last week, so definitely looking into. So definitely one of those I'd definitely highlight, or a good place to start would be Hacking the Cloud by Nick Frechette. He does a great job of cataloging different attack scenarios, different privilege escalation scenarios, and different TTPs he's done all the while. Those are definitely cool things to take a look into, especially, and just like playing with and seeing if you can replicate some of those behavior. Another thing I'd recommend is just, and I think you alluded to earlier, so what we're talking about is mastering those two things and how they would work, would be taking your pen test hat off, putting on emulating a cloud engineer and seeing what someone might have to go through in order to manage these resources. And you're going to find different things, but a little gotchas along the way that are frustrating to deal with, hard to do. Catalog those, because I guarantee someone got frustrated at some point and might have just taken the quick route because they had to get to production so they could have a wonderful weekend and not work through the weekend. Once you once you have a great understanding of those, using something like, let's say, there's a bunch of different ones. There's a piece of software you can use for, or a GitHub repo that has different scenarios that can use for vulnerable components. So an application, we might call this damn vulnerable application. We also might call it like Azure Goat, Kubernetes Goat. There might be different versions of this that are just purposely misconfigured. There's also, if you want to spend the money on it, is Hacking the Cloud Black Sky Labs to work with. Like, see that there are different things that you're hacking against certain cloud environments and seeing how those would work. But I definitely recommend taking those like kind of vulnerable cloud environments, deploying them into kind of a lab environment, and just seeing how different things work and working through some of those to give you ideas of, here's how pen testing usually works. We usually look at enumeration. We usually look at, here's a set of access I have, here's a set of access I need, and then here's the identity that I need to somehow compromise to get there. Or maybe here's another thing in the environment that I might be able to talk to that might have the level of access I would need. And this could be a server, this could be a service, this could be your identity's ability to give permissions to another service. There's a bunch of different gotchas and things under the hood that are important to understand that will help you grow and help you move into that direction of being able to take your already awesome pen test skills that you might have picked up through your OSCP and OSWE and apply them to cloud environments well and effectively.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Listen, it makes complete logical sense. If you don't understand the environment, to me, it says you're going to miss things. So it makes sense and it completely stacks up. But so basically, Tim, what we're saying is, if we can really get a head round identity access management controls, privilege escalation, we're really going to give ourselves a nice jump start in terms of cloud security progression. And the three best ways to do that certification wise are the ones you've mentioned: Intro Cloud certification AZ104, AWS Solution Architect, GCP Cloud Associate Engineer certification. So they're going to give us a really good foundation on identity access management within the cloud.
They will give you I would say, I will caution you saying they will give you the start. If you want to
Okay.
progress with and specifically, you'll notice in the security certifications for all of them, identity access management is one of the key focus because
Okay.
it can be complicated. There's a lot of gotchas, and these are where the most damaging vulnerabilities tend to lie. Of once you get it from an internal perspective, but once you get access to a resource that's fairly benign, and you've got a blast radius of maybe that service or that server or that storage bucket, but as soon as it grants you access to something else and you understand how access control works through the environment, either through identity access management control, you'll find a huge portion of those certifications are a really great way to mature your way into being an expert on IAM, regardless of cloud provider.
Okay, cool. Thank you, mate. And I like what you said as well about there's a lot of consistencies across vendors. I didn't even realise that. That sounds like music to a lot of people's ears. Is that what kind of consistencies are there? Sounds like we potentially save some time.
So I could talk ad nauseum about my views on the word multi-cloud and what that means and what it takes to engineer something to be multi-cloud. The idea is that I want to take the same, and this is where Kubernetes absolutely thrives, of saying that I
Okay.
want to take my same application and I want to be able to pick it up and drop it into one cloud environment to the next with minimal overhead and minimal engineering required. So what that means on paper is that I need to build something that is totally reliant on as little services as possible so that I have the least amount of technical debt.
Okay.
However, what I actually say that is a better option is to use the best the cloud provider has to offer and look at the patterning of your application and adapt that pattern to the strengths of per cloud provider. The cloud providers, for the most part, are competing for the same clients, the same markets. They have reasonable amount of parity across different services, such as you have compute resources, you have cloud functions, you have databases, you have machine learning, you have storage accounts. All of these different things are going to be offered across all of them. They might have different tweaks as far as how do you configure them, how a specific feature works, or maybe the performance of one versus another. But one thing to keep in mind is that they're all building for the same pattern or similar patterns. And while there might be differences, the functionality of how you might abuse them might be fairly similar. It's just the
Okay.
syntax, the specific policy things you're looking for, the specific configuration items may be different, but the similar way of how you would threat model and build your attack path from one end of the environment to the other might be similar, such as if we look at cloud agnostic terms such as service bus, compute resource, storage bucket, all of those things work roughly the same. I might, a storage bucket, for example, I send it a file, I retrieve a file. Great. I might host a static website there. Great. However, and per cloud providers, that functionality is there. However, the exact configuration policy might be slightly different. However, the same thing is if that storage bucket is exposed to the public internet or exposed to, let's say, all cloud accounts of a particular vendor, the ways that you're attacking might be different syntax. For example, AWS, I might use the AWS CLI. In Azure, I might use the AZ CLI. GCP, I might use G-Cloud, or there might be a specific S3 item. I won't go into semantics there, but the idea is that I'm still just going to use the CLI tool to pull that data down, or might abuse an application that has direct access to that environment. It's a similar attack path, a similar pattern, maybe different syntax, but once you start looking at the patterns across different providers, they're fairly similar. They have similar incentives to be secure enough so that customers want to keep coming back, want to continue purchasing resources. They want to make sure that their engineers can sleep at night or not constantly dealing with incidents. And they also don't want to see their customer data leak because that also is bad for business. So they're constantly getting better and better over the time. And a good example is that, what was it? So Google bought Mandiant, bought Squirrel Security at one point, and I'm struggling. And I believe Azure or Microsoft bought Risk IQ. All of those
Okay.
things were then taking those what were commercial off the shelf offerings and bought them both in house, extend them, and then use those new technologies to better secure themselves to make sure that they're the most secure offering and they can fight for more business. It is a It is. If the cloud wars are still
Yeah, yeah,
ongoing,
yeah,
we've
yeah.
selected the top three contenders. And if you'd asked me in 2015 who the top was, it was AWS by a mile.
Yeah.
Later, Azure started catching up. Later, GCP, and then also we had IBM SoftLayer as a cloud provider, Oracle as a super major player in some industries. They're still
Yeah.
around, but
Okay.
if you look at the market share, it's definitely a split between AWS, Azure, and GCP to date. So if I were a cloud pen tester listening to this podcast, those are the three I'd probably be focusing on the most. However, you might find in those third party, we'll call them cloud provider alternatives, similar patterns to how you might exploit a public cloud vendor, or maybe using the similar technology as the baseline of what you might be attacking. An example might be someone's running OpenStack on-prem and the similarities to how maybe Kubernetes or how other container systems could be exploited, or the different things of misconfigured Docker, misconfigured policy that might orchestrate containers.
Yeah, no, cool. Too. Listen, I think I'm really glad that you've told us that and you mentioned it, because I bet there's a lot of pen testers that have maybe got really good at, say, I use AWS again for an example, and they perhaps don't even realize how transferable some of their current skills are. So, listen, definitely worth mentioning. I know you said in terms of picking a vendor, pick where your passion is. If I'm just getting into it, Tim, but I haven't really got any preference on which vendor I learn. Which vendor would be, if I was to pick one, which would be best from a career progression perspective and moving me forward and stuff like that? Would you say?
That's a good question, and I have a couple different ways to answer that. If you want to be in demand and you want your cloud career to take off, and you don't really care which vendor, but you want the most in demand, honestly, I'd be looking at Azure. Azure pen
Okay.
testing is there's a lot of offensive security folks that are focusing on Azure and GCP. Not as much activity as in the Azure sector, and from a recruiting perspective, from a just looking at industry peers, Azure is one of the ones that we're always learning more about. We're always seeing new things come out of that environment and new techniques that we would have to try. And it's also coming down to industry adoption. The security industry might have gotten a hold of AWS first, or
Mm,
GCP might be super accessible for home labbing and figuring stuff out. But Azure having a barrier to entry, meaning more enterprise focused, might be something to learn, and that will give you transferable skills quick. That would be the one that if I had to start over and I needed to be instantly employable, I would definitely be looking at Azure. However,
okay.
I will also say that having a strong understanding of AWS and GCP is also may not be as high on the demand list, but is equally valuable as a pen tester.
Yeah, wicked. Thank you, Tim. Yeah, listen, I think all pen testers need to learn it, but I'm just thinking if I was a junior sat here now trying to get a foothold on the market, how fiercely competitive that junior end of the market is. If you want to go and get absolutely awesome at Azure and pen testing Microsoft Azure, you've got a really good chance to get a foothold on the market. So I really see this as a good opportunity in terms of progression for all pen testers. Yeah, I'll move on to the next question, Tim. So when it comes to learning all three vendors, the three vendors being Azure, AWS, GCP, which is there anything we should look out for? Any things to be aware of? Any kind of common pitfalls between the three main vendors?
Common pitfalls is something may not work exactly how you think it does,
Okay.
and the documentation may not always be super apparent as to what that behavior is. Whenever you're working with a cloud provider in general, my this is the process I follow when I'm looking at either building something from scratch or learning how something works, or learning what the security implications of a service are. Here's typically what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at the high level documentation, such as what are they marketing? What is this typically being used for? What industries are they pushing this out of? The AWS reInvent launch video is also a super great for both cert studying as well as understanding maybe what the business case or what this is really meant for. If there was a launch video or they're explaining the deep dive on the service, the next thing I'm going to look at when we start getting into the nitty gritty details is the developer documentation. And the developer documentation can be doing two ways. One, there's a developer guide or developer documentation that explains conceptually what's going on and the syntax and gotchas of what's supposed to be happening. Another thing I recommend looking at will be looking at maybe the Python SDK or your preferred language SDK to look at the different methods and what it seems to be doing. Under the hood, those methods are going to really tell you what is the attack surface and the things that you can really configure or do in this environment. And you might pick up different things like, please don't do something like this because this is insecure. That's one of the first things to be like, I should look for that. And why does it work that way? And what does that look like? Then you can take that same lessons learned from the developer documentation, look back at the development guide and maybe getting started guide of a service and be like, okay, let me spin one of these up in this environment. Let me poke at it. Let me see how it works. Let me walk through a couple tutorials. And then let me see maybe a pen testing technique that I've used somewhere else works in this environment, such as if I start password spraying this database and I know the database password is fairly weak, can I reasonably set, if I were to expose this to the public, can I password spray my way into this? Or an example might be, let's say that if you've deployed a cloud function and you've used a common vulnerability like maybe sour pickle, where we use the pickle library to send an insecure deserialized object that could potentially have something that could basically hijack that process and run something else that wasn't intended, and maybe attach that to SQS or maybe invoke something directly. There's a lot of different ways that you can experiment with these services. Just figure out how they work, and then apply more of your pen testing skills to say, okay. Or an example might be if you find a gap in an IAM policy, being like, I wonder if I can get there from here to here. Looking for those pivoting techniques, maybe if you're installing, and this is something you can do in your job. Maybe you're not in pen testing right now. Maybe you're in cloud engineering, maybe in system administration, saying that, okay, I'm going to give myself the role of maybe this appliance that I've installed, and it looks like for whatever reason they're saying it's a bunch of interesting actions, and then with a resource qualifier of star or a resource principal of star, meaning that pretty much whatever in that specific account I could potentially use this action against, and seeing if there's any way that I can either escalate privileges or affect something that may not be specific to what I was working on. And I'm giving a lot of AWS syntax and examples, but where I'm going with this is that experimentation, learning to learn, meaning learn to read documentation from an either SDK perspective or software development kit perspective, from the developer guide to the conceptual guide to the kickstarts, will all give you a better idea of how that service works, and then pair that with experimentation or maybe a quick online course either through Udemy or one of my favorites is A Cloud Guru. All of those things are going to make you that much better when it comes time to, okay, I'm in an environment, I have an objective, this piece of technology could be my pathway there. I've experimented with this before, or I could rapidly experiment on maybe my own piece of infrastructure outside of the cloud, outside of the target environment, figure out how I can make something work, and then abuse that in the client's environment. And then you're either, you may not always make it to target, but you're that much further along. And you can also apply that same sort of methodology to maybe you're assessing a vendor appliance, maybe you're assessing a maybe an application, and you realize there's some sort of, if the appliance may have a particular port, a particular protocol, and you're like, oh, that's abusable. Why is this? What can I do with this? Or in a web application, that library has a vulnerability. Maybe I should poke at that a little more and see if I can affect that. But learning to learn, such as doing the research, learning to read documentation, learning to pick out those fun security tidbits from documentation, is a really incredible skill to have and almost necessary in cloud environments, because
Okay.
I'm going to be honest, there's over 1,000 cloud services out there. I don't memorize every single one. One of the first things I'm going to do if I'm going to attack a particular piece of infrastructure, unless it's a very common pattern, is I'm going to first start out with the updated documentation. Because one other thing I didn't mention here is those thousands of cloud services, they're constantly being updated with new features.
Okay.
So whatever you might have done in your last pen test for the service might have changed between you and this pen test. That's one of the keys is you first got to read the documentation, look to see if there's anything new that you haven't seen before, or maybe there's a similar pattern or a Medium blog post out there that says that, hey, I found a cool way to do this. And you're like, oh, sweet, they haven't patched it yet. Let me go do this as well. And all of those all of those fun things are a necessary step when you're dealing with cloud. Is there's a couple of constants here. There's probably going to be more cloud services since the last time you did a pen test, and those cloud services are going to have new features, and you're not the only one attempting to abuse these things. So certain cloud vendors might be quick to turn certain features off or might restrict these in such a way so the impact may not be as great. That's awesome. That's on the CSP's shared side of the shared responsibility model. But the gotchas on the client side, as a pen tester, it's important to keep an eye out for those and be able to inform maybe who hired you to do the pen test to say that, okay, hey, this access policy here, because of this condition you said here, I was able to move in these directions, which probably wasn't your intention. And a cool example of this was, it was actually a web app, but the web app didn't qualify the storage bucket where a certain piece of file was, or a certain file was, and the same identifier or the application had access to many different storage buckets. So if I happen to know if I abuse the application, if I happen to know that this was over here, it wasn't necessarily a cloud misconfiguration, although one could argue it was, but it was to say that, okay, this was properly locked down, but it was under the application's responsibility to say that whether or not I enforce that you are authorized to have access to this piece of data versus this other one. And as a result, if they did not. And what happened was that by sending a request to another storage bucket, I was able to pull that data into the application and use that for the runtime execution. That's not something we typically want to happen, but and that's one of the important things actually I want to cover here is that in cloud security, there's a lot of talk about misconfiguration, CSPM, and that's where cloud security should be, shifting left by moving the CSPM and or infrastructure as code checking technologies into the pipeline. One of the also important things from an offensive security perspective is to say that we should never be working in a silo or never be afraid to look just a little bit farther from those tools to say that, okay, common network pen testing vulnerability right here, meaning that someone left a exposed port over here. I'm going to go hop to that. Or on the web application side, that the application logic might be slightly flawed. There might be a gap, and you might have access to something you may not have realized that might could get you further in your cloud pen test. And I could also say this to industry professionals is don't try not to be caught in that silo mentality, meaning that it's either my responsibility is purely on the CSPM and that's how I'm going to protect my organization. You have to be willing to look outside with that, partner with different teams, help other teams out, either understanding the cloud or help them or ask them, be like, hey, is there any way I could abuse XYZ technology? And they might go, oh yeah, or oh, and you're like, cool, because it's configured this way. They might go, oh no. And similar, and you can have those interactions go back and forth to make sure that you're actually rounding yourself out as a security professional and also rounding out those out around you.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So basically, there's a few things to just to go through with you there. So coding background, programming background, or at least some code review skills are going to be pretty essential with what you're talking about in relation to SDKs and looking at the code underneath it. So as with normal pen testing, with cloud pen testing, that's an important skill set.
You may not have to be an expert on all languages, but at least understanding. So when we look at programming, what something goes in, something goes out, and some action occurs. By understanding what's going into this or what context is being passed to this maybe function call, and we could simplify this. If we look at just the AWS CLI tools and the documentation, we have the tool itself, we have the service we might be interacting with, and we have the command, and then the arguments after. Even just looking at the CLI tooling is a great way to figure out what capabilities you might be able to affect. I bring up the SDK because certain things in the SDK may not be readily apparent in the CLI tooling itself, although sometimes they will mirror each other. Okay. So expanding off that, the reason that we're looking at the SDK is not necessarily just you don't necessarily understand what the code does. Specifically, you don't need to really implement it, but rather, what are the capabilities that this service has? For example, with an EC2, with an S3 bucket, I have the ability to upload files, do multi-part upload files, set access policies. And you go, cool, let me go read the guide documentation of what those look like and what the syntax needs to look like. And that just might be a JSON object. Well, what I will say, it's not quite a programming language, but learning to read JSON and YAML in cloud is essential.
Okay. Okay, cool.
It doesn't have a lot of development cloud, but it is something very important as a lot of configurations, including cloud security tooling, are driven by JSON and YAML configuration files.
Okay. Tim, another thing you said is there's new features and kind of functionality being added on a regular basis. So in my head, I'm thinking typically when we add functionality, we decrease security. So and again, I might be wrong, but am I right in thinking if these new features are being added, new functionality is being added, is the cloud getting less secure in some ways because of that?
Certain CISOs may think so. And you know what? There's probably some rationale to it. Oh no, there's a new service that comes out. That's another thing I have to worry about. But also, there are cases where maybe we're partnering with the cloud providers for new features actually is a boon, meaning that providing that feedback. So, for example, the Cloud Security Forum might interact with certain cloud vendors to say that, hey, we found this, a cool example. I think it was Scott Piper that actually tweeted about this. and it was regarding Lambda endpoints. This feature hadn't really been announced yet, but the SDK of it, or REST API schema, had been partially released or checked into GitHub in a public place. And the cloud security community dove on this and was just like, what is this? How does this work? And once they figured out what it did, they provided some feedback to AWS and say, hey, we need a feature or some security features to make sure that this doesn't get the, because the way this is like shipped today could potentially be very bad if released. And another example is if there's maybe a security service, or let's talk like threat detection or web application firewalls. If there was a way of protecting yourself, a way of detecting attacks you didn't have before, one of the cool things about cloud provider providing these new features is that they might be crowdsourced from many different vendors and many different customers. So releasing features, getting the kind of the global community come back to that uses this vendor to say, hey, we all have this customer pain of this. What's really cool about the cloud, what sort of cloud security features that could be released or products, is that it's been shaped by many different hands. It's not just on your company. It may not be exactly what you need for all of your conditions, but it's got enough features, enough customization capabilities that you get to take the benefit from that. So, for example, threat detection, let's talk about what that automatically gives you out of the box from day one. There's a lot of, if there's a Cobalt Strike going on in your environment, I believe there's a C2 DNS alert, or if there was some sort of privilege escalation sort of activity, may not catch it all, but it's a lot better than probably if you were starting from scratch saying that, all right, I'm going to do a bunch of detection engineering on my cloud audit logging to say that here's what's happening, here's what I need to do with this information, and here's why this is important. Someone's already done that for you, and it's just clicking a button and making sure that you can consume it via in your SIM technology, or or Slack channel I've seen as well. Just however
Okay.
you want to, however you want to be informed of this information. Just like using these security tools or what someone else might have shaped these or came up with a custom use case. These new features tend to be a boon a lot of the time from a security point of view. And then the cloud security community can also help shape what might new feature requirements, or and even you as a cloud customer might be able to talk to your cloud vendor rep to say, hey, I'm seeing these issues. I want to give you this feedback. Can you please consider or send this to your product team to make this into a security feature in the future? And that's the beauty of it. If it's one from a functionality that you need from a business perspective, or maybe a technology perspective, or it could be a security perspective, that process of being able to give back that feedback to those cloud providers actually is a boon, because it's not only you doing it, it's a lot of others as well.
Yeah.
And so yes, so we might all have common problems or common technical debt that cloud providers may have that we're all constantly dealing with or trying to fix. But we're all in this together of
Yeah.
there's ways that by providing feedback and providing constructive criticisms and feedback, we might be able to find a better path forward. And that's really what the true advantage of cloud might be in the future. There are a couple cases where we might have headaches. We might make mistakes. The cloud provider might make mistakes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, through mistakes, we learn.
Yeah.
And
Cool.
through learning, we make progress.
Yeah, cool. Tim, so there's loads of useful stuff there. I'm just going to just break a few things down for the listeners. When we're looking at, could be any of the main three cloud providers, you're always going to start at the high level documentation. There's that many different services, thousands of services. It's impossible to remember all. They get updated with new features on a frequent basis. So you're always going to revert back, even at your level, you're always going to revert back to the high level documentation, the launch videos. You're going to look at the development documentations, the syntax. You're going to look at the SDKs in Python or your preferred language. You don't necessarily need to be a developer or have an intrinsic understanding when it comes to code review, but you certainly need to be aware of the functionalities and the features related to each service. And you better learn JSON and YAML.
Absolutely.
Cool,
Absolutely.
wicked. I just wanted to summarize that so everyone got that. And you mentioned a resource as well. I think you said A Cloud Euro or something.
A Cloud Guru.
A Cloud Guru, sorry.
Yeah, they were acquired by Pluralsight, but the recognizable brand, from my point of view, Pluralsight might be offended by this, was A Cloud Guru, and the Ryan Krumenberg was the one that I believe him and his brother and a bunch of friends launched that service. And it definitely was the foundation of my cloud career starting out. I definitely recommend it, as I believe the content, their approach, and the pacing of the videos is super awesome. They acquired Linux Academy, and if you're trying to do anything cloud related and you need a training option, that is one of the first places I would go. There's a lot of feedback. There's a pretty good community built around it, and most importantly, as far as things that you want to put on your resume, they're geared toward the certifications.
Okay.
So it's not just that you're learning this to learn. You can do two things. One, you can learn about a particular subject, polish off a certification on your resume, and recruiters are looking for that. They're looking for certifications. They're looking for side projects and GitHub repos of cool things that you have done. Get the cloud certifications definitely help. Your experimentation, your side projects on a public GitHub definitely help. And then, of course, standard OSCP and OSWE certs help out as well.
Definitely. The analogy I give, Tim, is I see anything you're doing, whether it's a YouTube channel, whether it's stuff on GitHub, I always say it makes your resume 3D, three-dimensional. If you've got a resume and you've got experience and maybe a couple of certifications, but if you've got someone that's doing stuff online, has got a social media presence, I think it genuinely gives that resume that three-dimensional look. And I definitely think it increases your chances when it comes to getting the job or career progression in general. So yeah, couldn't agree more, buddy. But wicked. By the way, everyone, we'll put links in the show notes because Tim is mentioning like mega resource after mega resource, and even I'm forgetting some of them already, Tim. We'll definitely put links in the show notes. I'll piece them all together before I release the episode, and Tim, I'll get you to look at them to make sure I've got it all right. But we had Cloud Go about 10, 15 minutes ago as well. We've got these certifications that we mentioned earlier, but we've got Hacking the Cloud, Black Sky Labs, I think was about 20 minutes ago as well. So like I said, we'll get them all in the show notes. I know I promised you an hour, Tim. We've already been an hour, so sorry. I know you're a busy man.
I'm going to keep going if you want.
Cool, no, fine. I'm just worried about your time, that's all. But
all good.
No, okay. The next question I wanted to ask you, mate, about tooling within the cloud security world. Which tools are awesome? Which aren't? Which can't I live without? What's your favorite tool? What can you tell us about that, buddy?
So there's tooling for starting out, especially if you're not super familiar with the cloud environment or you're not super familiar with a particular cloud provider. And those are probably the CLI-based CSPM tooling. Shout out to NCC Group. Scout Suite is definitely one that I'm a big fan of. Prowler is out there as well. Cloudsploit. Those are the top three that come to mind of just like simple cloud things that like just here. Let me enumerate what's out there. Let me talk. I think and we're talking about enumeration. Bishop Fox has CloudFox out there. The other thing I'd probably recommend is specifically. This is purely. I'm not going to say purely. Specifically to AWS IAM attack path enumeration, getting good at reading the get identity access details from the AWS CLI command. I'll provide a link after this. And then either taking a tool that ingests that or using a tool that was developed by Lyft called Cartography, and using that to graph out your IAM privileges and being able to map out potential privilege escalations path and mirroring that context with Nick Frichette's Hacking the Cloud. Those are really fun tools to play with. I think another one for Azure might be Storm Spotter. I think there's another one out there that's maybe a little more up to date. All of these, and then if your company has budget, tools such as Palo Alto Prisma or Wiz are also probably the enterprise tools. So if you got access at the company and someone says, hey, do you want access to Wiz? Yeah, definitely say yes. Go play with that. There's a lot of fun things in there. And then also tools as far as the CI/CD pipeline. Learn Bridge Crew Checkoff. It's on GitHub. That's one of the fun ones to start comparing your infrastructure as code items. And whenever you're working with any of these CLI tools, whether it be a CSPM tool or an IAC code scanning tool, or maybe you're using something like Claire or some other Docker container scanner, or maybe Kubernetes audit tooling or security tooling, read the signatures. Learn to usually it's like plugin signatures and digging into those to see that what are those little things what is the functionality, what are the hiccups, what are they searching for and why? And do you have that in your environment? So whatever your tooling might be that may miss coverage of a particular service, you may want to go back and just check across the industry, be like, what are the common pitfalls either? And this could be within a piece of tooling. It could be just searching around on Medium to saying, hey, has anyone like security issues with XYZ surface? Or All of these little things are just things to dig into. And as you're progressing in your cloud security journey, you might just run like this one tool, or you might run like a CSPM. Maybe CloudSploit is a good example. So you might run CloudSploit to be like, hey, what's going on in my environment? Is there anything misconfigured in the back? And a great way to, and a fun place to do this, if you work at a company that has a legacy environment and you can get permissions to run like a read-only scan of this, go see what's misconfigured. The older the environment is and the more manually configured it is, the more fun things you're going to find.
Okay. Okay, cool. Tim, everything you're saying, it's like I'm taking a more of a, if I take an overview, it's leave no stone unturned almost. Like we talked about like mastering the environment. We've talked about looking at the code that sat behind what's going on. We've talked about understanding every feature and functionality. You've talked about reading the signatures. We've talked about, you, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying really get to grips with this and understand what's going. If you want to truly be able to pen this environment, whichever one it is, if you want to really push it to its limits and get under the skin, it's don't take any shortcuts, get excited about it, and do it properly.
It's a good summary. Yeah.
Thank you, man.
Yeah, definitely get excited, learn to learn to understand,
Mm.
and take that and always check your understanding. And you
Okay.
might find and when you check your understanding and you find something doesn't work exactly how you thought it might, or those are the security gotchas that you should file in the back of your mind and things to keep in mind, because you're not the only one that's encountering this. And there's someone that took a shortcut to do something, and you keep in mind if that's where those shortcuts exist, keep an eye out for it, because that those are the little gotchas that will help you out on that specific challenging pen test. And you may not even be a specific cloud pen test, you might be doing web app stuff, but if you know those little gotchas, or you find maybe cloud items in source code, that's fair game. The
Mm-hmm.
CLI commands to use that maybe cloud credential, that's something to check. And what I found is when there is a super complex or super fun cloud vulnerability, it's a combination of many different things that have gone wrong. And that's where the really fun vulnerabilities come out.
Okay.
So being able to chain together vulnerabilities is also a skill that you'll master over your cloud security career, both in a defensive depth of things to lock down, but also things to look for in your offensive security journey.
Okay, mate. And if we're an old, manually set up environment, it's time to have some fun.
Oh, definitely. That's where you find services that, oh yes, we configured that in 2013 and we're not even sure why it's still up. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Is
Okay.
anyone looking after this? No.
No.
Fantastic.
Tim, in terms of couple of questions in one. So, learning resources when it comes to the cloud. If you've got any go-to, you've given us loads already, mate. By the way, but if there's any more learning resources you've got for the cloud, and any learning resources to get good at using the tools to make sure you understand them in full.
So the two things I'd start off with is I definitely recommend a cloud guru or your preferred cloud training vendor of choice. I'm going to say Cloud Guru is definitely my number one.
Okay,
But
cool.
other things I would also look at if you're getting started is whatever, if it's like Azure Goat, I'm not sure if like a purposely vulnerable environment. I've mentioned this before, but if I would search GitHub for some of these resources. I'd search GitHub for tools. I'd search GitHubs for proof of concepts. All of those things are stuff you should be looking for as part of your cloud security journey, and will make you better in the end. Is one, understanding how a service is deployed, how something works, and also what others are doing in the industry. Yeah, those are definitely places to get started. There's a lot of other vendor training out there that might have a live pen testing course that you might do in person, maybe at Black Hat or DEF CON. Definitely recommend checking them out. There's a lot of different avenues to get there, but as you mentioned before, it all comes down to exposure, trying, experimenting, learning, and in the end, you end up with a wealth of experience that you can apply during your pen testing career to get to goal in ways that you may not have realized were there originally.
Yeah, cool, mate. Is Paco a good tool, Tim?
Packer, yeah, it depends on what. So a lot of those tools are purpose built for. They are built for pen testers. They do a great job, maybe with enumeration or specific exploit attempts. But what I found a lot of times is there might be a custom condition or a custom thing, and what you should learn from Pacu, or Pacu is the RhinoSec AWS tool. Some of the things you should learn from these tooling are the approaches and what they're doing, And you
Okay.
can emulate that in your own custom scripting, or even just through the CLI, if you can replicate the operations. When you'll find that a lot of the same operations that they're doing, yes, they might have some wrapper code around it to do certain functionality, but it's more important that you realize what they're doing and what they're after and
Yeah.
what they're looking for, how they're abusing a service, than maybe just learning that tool by itself. I would say
Okay.
that most of the time when we find some of the vulnerabilities are so easy to check that to say, okay, I need a cloud CLI and some credentials, and I will see if I can get access to something or run an operation like this. And those are some of the easy ones. And then there are certain situations where maybe you're opening up burp, maybe you're running just a password spraying utility, maybe you're running Metasploit, or maybe you've gotten a CLI access to a system and drop a Metasploit beacon and then are going to proxy traffic through it. What's more important is not necessarily the specific cloud security tools. If there were any of them I'd recommend experimenting with would be the CSPM like tooling.
Okay.
But what's more important is, are there any other tools in other silos or other pen testing focus areas that you can bring to your cloud environment, and why?
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. I'm getting from you loud and clear, whether it's tooling or feature services, function, understand what the hell's going on. Don't try and don't try and skirt over it at all.
If you
Basically.
do that, you might get into a situation where it worked one time, but you don't understand why it worked.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
that
It makes
perfect
it.
condition isn't there, and you don't know whether to abandon that specific avenue or try something slightly different because you know what you're trying to get after.
Yeah, yeah. And you could easily miss vulnerabilities if you don't grasp it in full. Yeah. Yeah, cool. Makes sense, mate. Makes sense. And all right, buddy. Listen, thanks, Tim. We've gone miles over time. So as we come to the end here, in terms of mindset and general approach or way of thinking as a pen tester, do you need to alter anything when it comes to pen testing the cloud compared to pen testing, say, a web app? Do you need any form of different mindset, or should you adjust the way your mind's conditioned in any way? Or
So one thing that you should always carry into kind of a, whether you're a cloud security practitioner, maybe more on the defensive side, or operating in an offensive security cloud area, threat modeling. Learning to threat model and do it well, and picking a lightweight framework to do so, can both help you boil down what are the things you should be looking for, maybe the soft underbelly in your security posture, where you need to focus more, and building that more of defense and depth item, or in the case of attacker, finding that soft underbelly to start poking at and trying to get to your objective, or different ways of abusing the environment. The mindset is very much the same. It's more about the knowledge and background knowledge of how the cloud works.
okay,
That's super critical in knowing that you may have to think a little bit out of the box, and or maybe very much in the cloud engineer box, such as, okay, I'm in this environment. I know that it's hard to configure something this way. What I should check to see if this is here in order to understand maybe if there's something I could abuse in the environment to get the goal. Or in another idea, let's say the stealth approach needs to happen. What are some of the things that traditional SIM technologies or their published rule sets are looking for nowadays? And what are the edge cases that maybe I could sneak around them? So similar, the mindset is still the same, but you're looking to apply the same mindset with a different maybe toolkit.
yeah, cool. Thank you, Tim. And mate, I'm going to ask you one question because you've obviously done well, mate, and you've progressed well throughout your career. Anyone coming through the ranks? Any tips in terms of moving forward in the industry in general? Listen, I always say to guests when they come on, if you sat there as technical director of Praetorian on pen testing the cloud security, it might all look good now, but I'm sure it hasn't always been plain sailing along the way. Any kind of tips for people progressing, anything that's really important, any kind of key things that have been instrumental to you doing well and progressing through the industry over the years that the listeners could learn from?
So something in general that I recommend, regardless, and it could be pen testing, it could be cloud security, it could be software development.
Mm,
Protect your skills. Depending on your passion areas in this industry, depending on what you want your career to be, if there is a particular skill set that you have acquired that is rare or isn't necessarily super commonplace and is very sought after in the industry, keep developing it, keep it sharp. We see a lot of, it's a very turbulent market right now. A lot of really good folks might have departed their previous employers with due haste, and it may not have been a desire of their own. But if I were to give any advice to someone either just in IT, computer science, any of those majors coming out of college, find out what the market is looking for, find out what's accessible to you, find mentors or influencers to follow that can tell you or can help you grow in a certain direction that you want to go. Talk to people that are in your dream job and ask them, how did you get there?
Yeah.
What skills did you learn along the way? What was your career progression like? Because what you'll find is that getting to your dream job is not always a straightforward path, but there was lessons they learned along the way to make it a more straightforward path. So, for example, if someone were trying to get into cloud, for example, one of the first things I'd recommend is go get a cert, go pick up system administration skills. That's what cloud engineering and that was back in probably 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017. Now it's you should learn how to use DevOps tooling that YAML and JSON or HashiCorp language, Terraform, or maybe Pulumi, those different technologies, maybe how to run Jenkins pipelines. All of those things are things that are open source. You can find YouTube tutorials on them. You can branch out from maybe a job that got your foot in the door, build out your skill set to what needs you, that makes you into something more palatable. Jump to maybe that junior role, work to grow and just absorb all the knowledge that you can, and just make sure that if there's a point in your career or a point where you're in about where maybe you're not learning anymore, you find your skills are stagnating, or maybe you're finding that at a position where you're probably the most senior in the room, you feel that you're in the wrong room, that might be a time where you look at either ways of progressing or saying, is there things I need to learn? Are there ways I can self develop? Unfortunately, in the last case resort, if you need to make a position change, definitely start prepping for your things there, or prepping in such a way of, okay, what are things in the market that people are looking for based on the skill sets I have that I could grow into or be a really good fit for? And learn to tailor your learning for that next item if that's what you really want.
Yeah.
Those are all things that are transferable across many different industries. It can be hard at times to action them, but if you keep learning, you keep sharpening your skill sets, you may keep getting better. You may not get your dream job the first time, but you can pivot your way into your dream job at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, definitely, Tim. And thank you, man. I think what you've said there is so applicable in offensive security because the industry moves so fast. So if you do feel like the smartest person in the room or you're not growing, it is a dangerous place to be because things move so fast. But listen, Tim, mate, thank you. Cloud security, honestly, for my day job as a recruiter, I talk to hackers all day, every day, and I talk to my clients on a very frequent basis. I know cloud, pen testing the cloud is a huge area that there's demand on the client side. I know some pen testers that are good at it already, but I know a lot that are trying to get better. So, mate, thank you for your time. I know I've kept you way longer than I said I would, so I do appreciate it, buddy. And is there anything else we need to cover, or think we're about done? No?
I think we're good.
Wicked.
Next up is the monster of editing you've got to do, but
yeah, yes, it is. Luckily, I've got a team that does that now, so we're okay. My resource has just become a pro podcast editor.
There you go.
It's quite handy, mate. So I can't take all the credit, but listen, Tim, thanks for your time, mate, and I'll see you soon, buddy.
Absolutely. You have a great one.
Cheers, mate. Bye bye.